Years had slipped by since the day when wealthy men, driven by greed and disdain, forcibly expelled him, his wife, and their daughter from their home. The memories of that traumatic event haunted him, but one fateful evening, he found himself staring at the television, and his heart raced as he saw a familiar face, his daughter, Alice. The screen flickered to life as the announcer cheerfully declared, "Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day." Alice's early childhood and adolescence were heavily shaped by the unwavering influence of her single mother, a woman with strict values and an unwavering vision for her daughter's future. From a young age, Alice learned that her mother's expectations were paramount. There was little room for her own aspirations or desires to flourish. Instead, she was molded into a reflection of her mother's dreams, a dutiful daughter who strived to meet every standard set before her. This dynamic left Alice feeling like a spectator in her own life, longing to express herself but constantly held back by her mother's imposing presence. As Alice approached her final year of college, her mother introduced her to Martin, a man of wealth and social standing. Her mother deemed him a suitable match, highlighting his accomplishments and the stability he could offer. Despite the accolades, Alice felt no genuine connection with Martin. There was no electric chemistry or profound bond that drew her to him. Nevertheless, having been conditioned to prioritize her mother's opinions over her own feelings, Alice reluctantly agreed to marry him. The thought of disappointing her mother was far more daunting than the idea of a future with a man she barely knew. Martin's affluent background provided Alice's mother with a sense of validation, and she assured Alice that marrying him would grant her a life of ease and comfort. She painted a picture of a luxurious existence, filled with fine clothes, beautiful homes, and social prestige. Reluctantly, Alice embraced this vision, hoping that compliance would eventually lead to her own happiness. On the surface, life after marriage did fulfill the promise of material comfort. Their home was adorned with exquisite furnishings, and Alice had access to all the material luxuries she could desire. However, beneath this glossy exterior, her emotional landscape remained barren and desolate. Despite the outward appearances of a perfect life, the reality of her marriage became painfully clear. Martin was not her partner, but her warden. He assumed control over every aspect of her existence, dictating her choices and stifling her individuality. Though he provided financial stability, the emotional and psychological constraints he imposed on her felt suffocating. Alice became increasingly aware that she was not regarded as a loving wife but rather as a convenient accessory to his life, a trophy to showcase to the world. Alice's passion for painting, the one flicker of hope that ignited her spirit, was a refuge in an otherwise controlled existence. She sought solace in teaching art classes at a local community center, where she could escape the confines of her home and connect with others who shared her passion. Each brushstroke allowed her to express the emotions she struggled to articulate in her everyday life. However, as the months turned into years, it became evident that Martin viewed her as little more than an obligation, a compliant wife who would not challenge his authority or disrupt his carefully curated lifestyle. Alice's days quickly fell into a monotonous routine, where she filled her hours with household chores and meals prepared for a man who rarely appreciated her efforts. She took pride in maintaining a pristine home, meticulously arranging every room and preparing elaborate dinners. Yet, despite her efforts, she often found herself dining alone, staring at an empty seat across the table. Martin's late-night work schedule became a frustrating norm, leaving Alice to feel increasingly isolated and invisible. By the time he returned home, she had already drifted off to sleep, her heart heavy with loneliness. The moment Alice felt the most profound happiness in her life came when she gave birth to her daughter, Ella. The overwhelming rush of love that enveloped her as she held her newborn child in her arms was indescribable. In that fleeting moment, she understood what it meant to feel fulfilled, to experience a love that transcended any material wealth. However, this joy quickly faded into a harsh reality as the challenges of motherhood set in. Martin's support waned significantly after Ella's arrival. With his parents living abroad, they could only see their granddaughter through photographs, which intensified Alice's feelings of isolation. Instead of receiving nurturing support from her own mother, she faced a cold reminder that her choices had consequences. "You chose this life," her mother had said, "and now you must deal with it on your own." This rejection deepened Alice's sense of despair, as she realized that the very people who should have offered comfort were now distant and unsympathetic. As the weeks turned into months, Martin's frustration grew, particularly as the cries of their infant daughter often disturbed his precious sleep. His irritability escalated, and Alice found herself navigating the tumultuous waters of new motherhood with little support from her husband. The pressures of caring for a newborn, coupled with the demands of her art classes, weighed heavily on her shoulders. She often felt overwhelmed, juggling the responsibilities of raising a child while trying to maintain some semblance of her identity. Frequent arguments erupted between Alice and Martin, often instigated by the stress of their chaotic household. Martin's voice would rise in anger, and he would lash out, his words cutting through the already fragile atmosphere of their home. Each argument seemed to deepen the chasm between them, pushing Alice further into isolation. The cries of little Ella would echo in the background, adding to the chaos and highlighting the discord in their lives. Desperate for relief, Alice reached out to her mother, hoping for empathy and guidance. Instead, she was met with a chilling response: "You chose this life, Alice. Don't come running back to me." The dismissal struck her like a blow, leaving her feeling abandoned and alone. This lack of support pushed Alice deeper into despair, as she realized that she had no one to turn to in her time of need. Compounding her feelings of isolation was her brother, who had moved in with their mother to pursue his career. His presence served as a constant reminder of the family dynamics that had always overshadowed Alice's desires and choices. Her mother frequently compared Alice's struggles to her brother's successes, reinforcing the belief that Alice had somehow failed in her life. The weight of these comparisons bore down on her, making her feel even more trapped in a situation from which she could see no escape. In the quiet moments, as she stood in front of the easel with her paintbrush in hand, Alice dreamed of a life where she could be free to express herself, raise her daughter without fear, and forge her own path. She longed for the courage to break free from the suffocating expectations and limitations that surrounded her. Each stroke of paint was an act of defiance, a silent rebellion against the constraints that bound her. But every day felt like an uphill battle against the expectations of others and the constraints of her marriage. Alice yearned for a way out, a chance to reclaim her autonomy, to build a life that was authentically hers, and to be the mother she always dreamed of being for Ella. Everything Alice needed was right before her eyes: the love of her daughter, Ella, and the hope of a new beginning. This was a stark contrast to her brother, who relentlessly chased after success, often at the expense of family connections. While he thrived in his pursuits, Alice found herself trapped in a suffocating situation, where her dreams were stifled by the weight of her marriage to Martin. During these trying moments, Alice discovered solace in the innocent presence of her daughter. Ella, with her bright eyes and infectious laughter, became Alice's anchor in a storm of chaos. Each day, as Alice watched Ella play, she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. In the quiet moments, she would lean down and whisper softly into her daughter's ear, "We'll be leaving soon, my darling. Just a little longer." These words, though meant to comfort Ella, were also a promise to herself, a promise that she would find a way to escape their current life. Determined to create a better future, Alice began to save money in secret. Each week, she scrutinized their grocery list, skimping on luxuries and buying only what was absolutely necessary to sustain them. Martin, her husband, rarely gave her cash. He preferred to handle all expenses himself, wielding control over their finances like a weapon. This forced Alice to be resourceful, finding creative ways to stretch their meager budget, whether it was through clever meal planning or foregoing small personal items. Days turned into sleepless nights, especially as she nursed Ella back to health through a persistent illness. Alice often found herself pacing the small apartment, the sounds of Ella's restless sleep echoing in her ears. On one particularly exhausting morning, Martin returned home around 11 a.m., swaggering through the door with an air of superiority. He was accompanied by a younger woman, her face heavily made up, radiating confidence. The sight of them together felt like a slap in Alice's face. Martin's disdainful gaze fell upon Alice as he declared, "Alice, this is what a real wife should look like. Have you even brushed your hair today?" His words dripped with contempt, cutting deep into her already fragile self-esteem. Alice stood there, frozen in disbelief. She knew that no matter how eloquently she argued her worth, it wouldn't change his perception of her. Deep down, she felt defeated, trapped in a relationship that had long since withered into something unrecognizable. "Pack your things and take Ella with you," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "There's going to be a new lady of the house, someone I'm not ashamed to show off to my friends." The venom in his voice was palpable, and Alice felt a mix of relief and sadness wash over her. She realized that she was finally being freed from the chains of Martin's contempt, yet the thought of facing her mother filled her with dread. Their relationship had been strained for years, and Alice feared her mother's reaction. As she began to gather their belongings, her hands trembled slightly, a mixture of anxiety and excitement coursing through her veins. She dialed her mother's number, seeking support and comfort. Instead, she was met with harsh words that cut even deeper than Martin's disdain. "Martin's right," her mother chastised. "You should take better care of yourself. And don't think for a second that you can come back here." Each word felt like a rejection, and Alice's heart sank further. With determination, she turned back to packing, carefully sorting through Ella's beloved toys and clothes. She crammed them into a small suitcase, feeling the weight of each item as if it carried the memories of happier times. As she finished, Ella, clutching her cherished stuffed bunny, approached her with wide eyes. "Mom, I heard everything. I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil around them. Alice knelt down and enveloped her daughter in a tight embrace, her heart swelling with pride and love. "You're so brave, my little one. Let's go," she whispered, feeling a surge of hope as they prepared to leave the life that had suffocated them for too long. As they stepped outside, Martin called after them, his voice cold and dismissive. "Leave me your address so I can send the rest of your stuff. The cleaning lady will pack it up tomorrow." Alice turned slightly, feeling a mix of defiance and relief. "Just send it to my work," she replied, knowing that at least Mrs. Evans, the kind-hearted cleaning lady, would handle her belongings with care and respect. Once outside, Alice immediately dialed Mrs. Evans, who promised to pack up the remaining items and mentioned she knew of a friend renting a small studio apartment. Grateful for the support, Alice and Ella made their way to the address provided, her heart racing with anticipation. When they arrived, the landlady, a warm and gentle elderly woman, listened intently as Alice recounted her story. Initially hesitant to accept any rent, the woman eventually agreed after Alice insisted she had some savings and a steady job lined up. Settling into their new home, Alice found herself in a small but warm and inviting space. The studio was modest, yet it radiated comfort with its sun-drenched windows and cozy nooks. For the first time in years, Alice felt the burdens of her past lifting. Mrs. Evans often watched over Ella while Alice worked, providing a sense of community that Alice had longed for. In exchange, Alice would clean the apartment and prepare meals for Mrs. Evans, fostering a bond that brought joy to her otherwise tumultuous life. As the days turned into weeks, Alice began to rediscover herself. She surrounded herself and Ella with laughter and love, creating an environment that felt like home. For the first time in a long time, Alice felt a sense of belonging, nurtured by the kindness of those around her. With each passing day, she grew more confident, embracing the future with hope and determination. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun cast a warm glow over the vibrant landscape as Alice and her daughter, Ella, set out for the park. The leaves, painted in hues of orange, red, and yellow, crunched underfoot, creating a symphony of sounds that accompanied their playful laughter. They were on a mission to gather materials for a craft project assigned by Ella's kind-hearted kindergarten teacher, a task that filled their hearts with anticipation and excitement. As they walked, Alice's mind was filled with thoughts of the possibilities that awaited them. The air was fresh, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the fragrance of decaying leaves. They arrived at a small clearing where trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Together, they set to work, carefully collecting an array of colorful leaves, shiny acorns, and sturdy twigs. Ella's small hands eagerly filled their bag, her eyes sparkling with delight at each new treasure they found. After they had gathered a satisfying amount of materials, Alice suggested they take a break. They found a weathered wooden bench nestled under a grand oak tree and settled down, both panting slightly from their adventure. "We did a great job," Alice exclaimed, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Now we just need to figure out what to make with all of this." Just then, a friendly male voice chimed in from a nearby bench, startling them slightly. "You could make an owl from the leaves. I used to do that when I was a kid. And a hedgehog with the acorns." Alice turned to see a man with a gentle smile, his eyes sparkling with fond memories of his own childhood. "Thanks for the idea," she replied, her curiosity piqued. "We've gathered so much, we could share some materials with you if you'd like." The man shook his head, his smile widening. "Thank you, but I don't have any children," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Surprised by his response, Alice asked, "Really? I just assumed you remembered the owl because you had kids." The man introduced himself as Daniel, and as he spoke, Alice learned that he often visited the park to relive the cherished memories of his youth. "When I was a child, my mother and I would come here all the time. We would collect things just like this and make crafts together," he shared, his voice tinged with warmth and a hint of longing. An instant connection blossomed between them, and Alice felt a spark of camaraderie. They began to share stories about their lives, discovering that they had much in common. Both Alice and Daniel were musicians, though their instruments differed. Alice played the piano while Daniel played the violin. Their weekends soon evolved into a delightful routine filled with laughter, creativity, and music, as Daniel joined them in the park week after week. He would play joyful melodies that danced through the air, enchanting Ella and bringing smiles to Alice's face. As winter approached, the chill in the air brought a new layer of excitement to their outings. They reveled in winter activities, building snowmen with Ella and sipping steaming cups of hot cocoa, their hearts warmed by the joy of each other's company. One day, while walking home hand in hand, Ella looked up at her mother with curious eyes and asked, "Mom, why doesn't Daniel ever come to visit us? I told Mrs. Evans about him, and she doesn't mind." Alice felt a rush of emotions, reluctance, embarrassment, and a tinge of fear. Daniel always walked them home but had never crossed the threshold of her apartment. She hesitated, unsure of how to explain her reservations to Ella. "It's just that. I'm not sure if he wants to," she replied softly, her voice trailing off. But Ella, with the boldness only a child could possess, took matters into her own hands. On their next walk, she turned to Daniel and boldly invited him over for a visit, her innocent enthusiasm shining through. To Alice's surprise, Daniel accepted without hesitation. When the moment arrived for Alice to share her story with Daniel, she felt a mix of anxiety and relief. She led him into her cozy apartment, where the scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air. As they settled down, Alice found herself opening up about her past, the challenges she had faced as a single mother, the struggles of making ends meet, and the moments of doubt that clouded her mind. Daniel listened intently, his expression filled with understanding and compassion. He never judged her, instead, he offered a comforting presence that made her feel safe. As the months turned into a year, their friendship deepened, woven together by shared experiences and genuine affection. They continued their weekend outings in the park, each moment strengthening their bond. One sunny afternoon, while sitting on their favorite bench surrounded by the beauty of nature, Alice felt a surge of courage rise within her. She took a deep breath and turned to Daniel. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling slightly with vulnerability. "I can't keep silent anymore. I love you." She looked deeply into his eyes, hoping to see the same love reflected back at her. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as she awaited his response. Daniel's expression softened, but Alice could see a flicker of sadness lingering in his gaze. "Alice, there's something I need to tell you. It's the reason we can't be together." Confused and anxious, Alice pressed on, "Is there someone else? Are you worried about our age difference?" He shook his head slowly, the weight of his words evident in his tone. "No, it's not that. A year ago, when we first met, I had just come from the doctor. I was diagnosed with a serious illness and told I didn't have much time left. I underwent treatment, but it was too late. The doctors gave me 6 months. Meeting you and Ella extended my life beyond that, but I don't know how much longer I have." Alice was taken aback, her heart racing as she tried to process the gravity of his revelation. Silence enveloped them, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the harsh reality of Daniel's words. After a long pause, Daniel continued softly, "Now that you know, will you find time for me?" Unable to articulate her feelings, Alice nodded silently, overwhelmed with emotion. The rest of their walk home was filled with a heavy silence, each step echoing the weight of their unspoken fears and hopes. The next day, Daniel picked Alice up from work, his demeanor calm yet serious. He led her to a notary office, and Alice's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Distracted by the weight of their conversation and the uncertainty that loomed ahead, she barely paid attention to what she was signing. Each stroke of the pen felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream. After they left, Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady and sincere. "Move into my house, which is now also yours. I won't have much time to give you and Ella the love and attention you deserve, but at least I can leave you with a home and some savings for the future." His words hung in the air, heavy with both hope and heartbreak, as they stood on the brink of a new chapter in their lives, intertwined by love, kindness, and mutual support. Alice had been struggling for some time, her energy and finances drained by the relentless demands of her treatments. Despite her determination to stay strong for her daughter, Ella, it was clear that she could no longer manage on her own. Recognizing the need for additional support, Ella moved in with her uncle Daniel the day after the decision was made. Daniel, always the dependable and caring figure in their lives, welcomed Ella with open arms, ready to offer her the stability she needed during such a difficult time. However, life had other plans. Just a week after Ella settled into Daniel's home, Daniel himself was rushed to the hospital. The suddenness of his illness shook the family to its core. With Daniel now unable to care for Ella, Mrs. Evans, a compassionate and motherly neighbor who had known the family for years, quickly stepped in. She moved into Daniel's house, taking over the responsibility of looking after Ella while Alice remained at the hospital, refusing to leave Daniel's side. Every day, Mrs. Evans would bring Ella to the hospital for a visit, understanding that these moments together were precious, especially as Daniel's condition continued to decline. A month slipped by in a haze of worry and exhaustion, and it became painfully clear to Daniel that his time was running out. His body grew weaker by the day, but his mind remained sharp, and his thoughts were focused on Alice and Ella's future. One afternoon, as Alice sat beside him in the hospital room, holding his hand, Daniel's voice broke the silence. Though frail, there was an urgency in his tone that made Alice's heart skip a beat. "Alice," he murmured, his breath shallow, "I need you to promise me something." Alice, sensing the gravity of his request, leaned in closer, her eyes locked onto his, searching for the strength she feared she didn't have. "Anything, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Promise me," he continued, his words slow but deliberate, "that you and Ella will find happiness. Don't close yourself off from the world. Don't be afraid to let someone else into your life, someone who will love and cherish you both. And never, ever let anyone treat you the way Martin did." Daniel's eyes, though dimming, were filled with a deep, unwavering love, and a plea that came from the depths of his heart. Tears streamed down Alice's face as she nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of his request. "I promise, Daniel," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She knew these were his final wishes, and she vowed to honor them with all her being. Daniel gave her a faint smile, a look of peace washing over his features as he squeezed her hand one last time. Not long after, with Alice by his side, Daniel passed away quietly, his soul departing this world, leaving a void that could never truly be filled. The news of Daniel's death spread quickly, casting a pall over the community. He had been a beloved figure, not just to his family, but to everyone who knew him. His funeral was a solemn yet beautiful affair, attended by the entire orchestra he had been a part of for so many years. Colleagues, friends, and family gathered to pay their respects, their hearts heavy with grief. As the music played in the background, a tribute to the life Daniel had lived, many wept openly, unable to contain their sorrow. 40 days later, the community came together once more for a concert held in Daniel's memory. It was a grand event, filled with emotion, as those who knew him sought to honor his legacy through the music he had loved so dearly. The highlight of the evening came when Ella, now just a young girl but already showing signs of the incredible talent she had inherited, took the stage. The audience fell silent as she sat at the piano, her small hands poised over the keys. With a deep breath, she began to play Daniel's favorite piece. The notes flowed from her fingers like a river, carrying with them the love, loss, and memories of the man who had meant so much to her. As the final chord echoed through the hall, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. 6 years passed, and life, as it tends to do, gradually moved forward. Mrs. Evans, who had become an integral part of their lives, was bustling around the kitchen, preparing a special dinner. The aroma of her cooking filled the air, a comforting reminder of the warmth she brought into their home. Ella had just returned from a regional music competition, where she had emerged victorious, winning first place against some of the best young talents in the region. It was a moment of immense pride for the family, a validation of the hard work and dedication that had gone into nurturing Ella's gift. As Mrs. Evans prepared the meal, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that they were about to celebrate a significant milestone in Ella's life. They were expecting Alice, Ella, and David to return home any moment. David, a kind and loving man who had come into their lives a few years after Daniel's death, had brought joy and stability back into their world. He and Alice had fallen deeply in love, and over time, David had become a father figure to Ella. She adored him, and he adored her right back. Ella now called him Dad, a title he wore with pride, knowing that he had earned it through love and patience. That evening, after dinner, they gathered in the living room, the television playing clips of Ella's competition. The room was filled with laughter and excitement as they watched Ella's performance, reliving the moment of her triumph. Pride radiated from Alice and David's faces, their hearts swelling with happiness as they saw how far Ella had come. But in a stark contrast, on the other side of town, Martin sat alone in a dimly lit room. His life had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The man who had once seemed so confident and in control was now a shadow of his former self. His parents, realizing that he was driving the family business into the ground with his reckless decisions and poor judgment, had removed him from his position of power. The woman he had left Alice for, thinking she would bring him happiness, had long since abandoned him, taking a substantial amount of his money with her. Now, he was left with nothing but his regrets and a hollow sense of what could have been. As he sat in his lonely apartment, flipping through channels, he stumbled upon the program broadcasting Ella's music competition. He watched, intrigued by the talent on display, but as the camera zoomed in on Ella's face, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. He couldn't quite place it, but something about her felt known, a ghost from a past life. He stared at the screen, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. When the award ceremony played, Martin's heart clenched as he listened to Ella's acceptance speech. "I dedicate this victory to Daniel," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He gave my mother and me faith in life after my father's betrayal." The words hit Martin like a punch to the gut. In that moment, the pieces fell into place. Ella was Alice's daughter, the child he had once ignored, the family he had thrown away. Now, as he sat alone in his darkened room, watching the bright and hopeful face of the girl on the screen, the weight of his choices pressed down on him like a stone. The story concluded with a heartfelt message to the viewers, thanking them for tuning in and encouraging them to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. It was an invitation to reflect on the tale they had just heard, to share their thoughts, and to connect with others who had been moved by the narrative.